Good afternoon and salam. I am Myriam, a member of the Macfest team. I am delighted to welcome you to Macfest 2022. This afternoon, we are thrilled to host Islamophobia and Muslims in the Media event. Our initial host, Dr. Myriam Francois, is currently unable to join us, but we have Ismael Lea South, who has been a speaker in this panel in previous festivals and will be stepping in as the host. Let me share a few words about Ismael. He's an independent youth work consultant and a cultural researcher. He's also the founder of the Salam Project, which is an award-winning youth engagement social enterprise that works in London and Manchester. For over 10 years, he has been very active in anti-youth crime, Black British history in the British school curriculum advocacy, and an ex-offender resettlement. He manages cultural research, youth engagement projects for institutions, publishers, local authorities, community cohesion organizations, faith institutions, statutory organizations, and universities around the UK. He is a guest lecturer at Chester University and is a strong advocate for youth work social entrepreneurship. He is a married father of two who lives and works between London and Manchester. Before I hand over to Ismael, I would like the audience to please follow Macfest on our social media sites and share the news about the festival using the hashtag #SpreadHoneyNotHate. And we also welcome donations. Thank you, and over to you, Ismael.
Thank you very much, Sister Myriam, for that wonderful introduction. May Allah bless you. Thank you very much. Salam alaikum, peace, love, greetings, namaste to everyone. Hope everyone is happy and glad to be here. While people are coming, I'm just rambling on, but thank you very much. We're very honored. We'd like to thank Macfest for organizing this panel discussion online on Zoom, so people from the UK as well as abroad and other cities can join in. So we're very honored and blessed to have a wonderful panel of distinguished speakers, and I'm honored to be speaking amongst them. As our beloved sister said, the lady who's supposed to be the host, Sister Myriam, due to unforeseen circumstances, is not available at the moment, but you never know what the future might bring. She might pop in the next 20 minutes time or so. So we pray for her. Okay, so our distinguished lineup are as follows. We have Sister Lynn Cooper, who is also the High Sheriff of London. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Ismael. I'm so delighted to be part of this panel, but I shall say a little bit more on that for the moment.
Yes, that's great. Nice to hear. The next panelist is a former ambassador and currently a professor, Akbar Ahmed, who currently resides in the US of A. He's a poet, a broadcaster, and also an academic, and he's very well versed in many topics as being a professor. Welcome, Professor Akbar Ahmed.
Thank you, Brother Ismail. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, my wife's favorite Islamophobia political analyst. So I have to make sure I get this right. If not, I'm going to get in trouble at home with the missus. And basically the former chair of the Conservative Party and the #1 voice of Islamophobia in the UK, Baroness Sayeeda Warsi. Welcome, sister. All right, then, so the first speaker is Lynn Cooper, who's the High Sheriff of Greater London. Take it away.
Thank you so much. As I mentioned very briefly, it's a great pleasure to me to be invited to be a guest to this panel of such distinguished speakers on what is an undeniably important topic. I think it would probably also be fair to mention that, unfortunately, Islamophobia is not the only example of attitudes and behaviours that can lead to otherness and can lead to exclusion, marginalisation, and of course, perhaps more profound impacts of abuse and hate crime. And I think for me, and I will say a little bit more about my role in a minute, but for me today is an opportunity to listen to all of you, but also to reflect. I think reflect, which I would encourage everybody to do, on how their own attitudes may at times lead them into a path that is not sufficiently vigilant enough to help combat or counter the attitudes that we hear of others that are just not acceptable. So if you like, that is a call from me to reflection. And I think it's a particularly pertinent day upon which to be doing this, because of course, this is the day 70 years ago when Her Majesty the Queen acceded to the throne. And we have, I think, in front of us a lifetime of service and steadfast service. And many people will no doubt be reflecting on this today, but I think I'd like to just mention a couple of things which are personal in my thoughts to what I think that also means, because sometimes that's not unpicked. It is service to all peoples, not just of this country, but in others to which she has the position as head of state. But if we look beyond that in her work as head of the Commonwealth, she exemplifies to me the importance of connection, of building and maintaining bridges amongst peoples of such diverse nations to encourage dialogue, understanding, mutual respect, celebration of culture, of arts. And it is this, I think, building of bridges between communities on a small level or on a wide level that is so fundamental to the well-being of all peoples and indeed to peace. Now, in my role as High Sheriff of Greater London, I'm appointed by a year to prevent her interests in the judiciary and the wider justice system. I think the wider justice system embraces the potential, of course, to do what I have been doing as the heart of my work this year, connecting communities where I can. A lot of it, sadly, has had to be online, but connecting communities and also celebrating the contributions that all communities make to support each other, which has been so particularly, I think, apparent through COVID. So I wish to say that in that role of being that representative this year, it has been my privilege to engage with so many communities, which I think have at their heart connection, togetherness, and peace. I had the privilege of holding a Thanksgiving service to do that, to thank people in our communities and to celebrate what they have been doing. And I borrowed the words of Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu, who sadly died so recently, who we know of as such a lion in fighting injustice and the barriers to full participation in the political, social life and institutional life of South Africa for so many people. But of course, I think what we also forget, that his work, and particularly his work post the dismantling of the apartheid system, has been on reconciliation, to reconcile people. And often that is a slower burn than the initial fight. And I borrowed three words, if you like, this is a bit of a paraphrasing, which I thought was so apposite to the service I held, but in the sense to this conversation more broadly, that there is no peace without justice, and there is no justice without compassion. And that compassion is underpinned by understanding, mutual respect, tolerance, and of course, the capacity for forgiveness. So I put those reflections out there as reflections that I think are very pertinent to my role and to encourage that connectivity in Greater London, in the communities that I see. But of course, my participation here is to hear the wonderful conversation that I am about to hear, and to thank you all for all you're doing to help combat Islamophobia. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lynn, for your great contribution and words of insightfulness. Thank you very much. Now, the next speaker coming forward is Dr. Professor Akbar Ahmed. I'm going to give him a brief introduction. He's the ambassador. Akbar Ahmed is the Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies at the American University in Washington, D.C. Ahmed's career has included distinguished posts in both academia and public service. Highlights from the past 4 decades, not years, decades, of Ahmed's academic career includes appointments such as non-resident senior fellow of the Brookings Institution, the first distinguished chair of the Middle East and Islamic Studies at the US Naval Academy, the MD of the Akbar Fellow, Chair of Pakistan Studies, and Fellow of Selwyn's College at the University of Cambridge, and teaching positions at Harvard University, Princeton University. Ahmed's dedicated more than 3 decades to the civil service of Pakistan, the senior most position of the Central Superior Services of Pakistan, where his posts include commissioner and political agent in the tribal areas, including, pardon my bad pronunciation if I pronounce it wrong, Waziristan, and Pakistan High Commissioner to the UK and Ireland. Ahmed's expertise has earned his praise around the world. The BBC has called him the world's leading authority on contemporary Islam. Without further ado, may I please introduce Professor Akbar Ahmed.
Thank you, Brother Ismail, for that very warm and generous introduction. I'd like to take this opportunity to first of all thank my host, Kesra Shiraz, for organizing this and inviting me, and of course for the great, well-deserved honor that she's received. I'd like to thank the very distinguished panelists of which I form a part. I'm very honored. My iconic hero, Baroness Warsi, is on the panel. For me, that's a great honor. And of course, I welcome the Macfest colleagues, and particularly in this great Jubilee year that the Sheriff has reminded us of. I want to, for a moment, reflect on this very important subject, the title, Islamophobia, particularly where it stands today in the media. It's about 2 decades, maybe a bit longer than 20 years, since 9/11. So it's a good time to look back and take stock. What I'm seeing, because I was involved, as Ismail pointed out, in this effort to fight against Islamophobia for the last few decades, what I see is that there are distinct signs, positive signs, particularly women. Women have emerged, and I'm delighted. I mean, you see this prominence of women in this particular panel, the leadership that Kesra and Baroness Warsi and all have provided. The youth, and of course, many of these women are very young, and there are many other youthful figures emerging. And then the genuine interfaith movement. Now, in my time, 2 or 3 decades ago, there was very limited interfaith movement. So these are really good signs. At the same time, you are also seeing some challenges. And by challenges, I mean genuine challenges of hatred that start taking in other communities, not just the Muslims. So you're seeing signs of Islamophobia, we are familiar with that. But you're also seeing anti-Hinduism phobia, anti-Sikhism. You're seeing anti-Semitism that is rearing its ugly head again, and you're seeing signs of anti-Semitism, attacks on synagogues, attacks on individual Jews happening not only in England and Europe, but in fact in the United States as well. So I sense that we're at a kind of plateau as far as this subject is concerned. We still haven't quite gone over the hump. There's much work to be done. At the same time, there are some alarming developments. Now, I do want to point this very important forum, because it's a forum we should not underestimate in terms of importance, in terms of thought, ideas. These ideas that this forum needs to contemplate. You may have read Gregory Stanton's famous thesis, his codification of the processes of genocide. He's pointed out the 10 stages of genocide, and he's president of the Genocide Watch. So he studied genocide in different parts of the world. And he's pointed out that these steps start 1, 2, 3, 4, and they lead to genocide. Now, I teach a course on peace, and I tell my students that hatred is a slippery slope. You begin to focus on one minority, very soon it becomes another minority and then another minority, and soon all of society is involved. And very quickly you have violence accompanying the hatred. We studied the Rwanda case in detail, and if you haven't seen the film Hotel Rwanda, it's well worth seeing. And you'll notice that the majority community had started calling the minority cockroaches. So they had started abusing them, demeaning them, sidelining them, and then that led to violence and then to the butchery of almost 1 million people, just unimaginable, with machetes. So Gregory Stanton is pointing out that the hatred that has been generated through this misunderstanding, through Islamophobia and other phobias, is a worldwide phenomenon. We need to be worried. And I, as a Muslim father, as a Muslim grandfather, and I'm constantly worried and concerned because I look at the television, I look at the news, and I'm seeing Muslims either being banned to a country or being put in camps or being warned that we are going to wipe you out. People are actually publicly, important officials saying that in the next 2 years, we'll wipe out every Muslim in this land. So this causes a great deal of anxiety in me because as a father and grandfather, I'm saying, what happens to my future generations? What happens to them? And again, in Hotel Rwanda, one of the things that the leaders of the other community, the majority community, kept saying is, wipe out the next generation, kill the next generation. There should be no generation, next generation. So, you know, you have women being attacked wearing a hijab, or a man with a beard, or a mosque or a house of worship, whether it's a synagogue or a Hindu temple, and that's bad enough. But this hatred is very deep and it's very historic. You heard yesterday the statue in France to Abdul Qadir, the great hero of North Africa, that was defaced. It was vandalized. So people are reaching back into history to express their hatred. And we have to, I think all of us on this conference, on this panel, need to renew our energy, renew our running on this almost treadmill, to renew and run even faster, because as we run to promote understanding and build bridges, we are also noting that there are people who are spreading hatred, and with hatred, they're talking of violence. They're abusing the minority and they're targeting the minority. Rigorous conferences, academic exercises, reaching out, particularly in the media. You mentioned media in the title. The media, and I'll end on this, the media is perhaps the biggest challenge for us, because for almost several decades now, Muslims are almost non-existent. When I was an undergrad in England in the 60s, a very famous film, you may have seen it, Lawrence of Arabia, had come out early in this, I think 1960 or 61. And I went down from Birmingham, where I was studying, to London, to Leicester Square, to see the opening there. It was one of those grand historic classic films. And I was there very excited with some other Pakistani friends, because we were told a Pakistani actor, Zia Moinuddin, had played a role in it. And we waited for him to appear. And famously, he appeared for about a minute and then he was shot, and that was the end of him. And I was told later that at that stage, Hollywood was not quite prepared to have an Asian or a Pakistani playing a lead role. So from then to today, when you have Adil Akhtar and Riz Ahmed and Hassan Minhaj and Aziz Ansari and so on, constantly appearing in the media and making an impact, I really feel we made a great deal of progress. And here we must give full marks not only to these individuals who achieved so much, but also to the larger society within which they operate. This could not have happened without so many people in Britain and America reaching out to the minorities and welcoming them in. I know there's opposition and there's tension and there's misunderstanding, but there are also hundreds of thousands of people saying enough is enough, the time has come now to put the past behind us and build bridges. So I think, again, it's a moment for me studying this whole movement of Islamophobia over the decades, where we are right at the tipping point. It can go in one direction or in another direction. If we continue our efforts with the sincerity and the vigor with which we are doing, we'll go over the top and hopefully into a better, more harmonious and a more prosperous life for everyone. If not, we will revert. And again, I want to warn you of Gregory Stanton's words that the 10 stages of genocide are already in motion. So you have to keep that in mind and continue the challenge. I will end with the famous quote of from Judaism, one of my favorite quotes, which is Tikkun Olam, which is to go out and heal a fractured world, heal a fractured world. For me, I'm always inspired by Bulle Shah, who's a great poet of the Punjab from Pakistan, a great Sufi mystic poet, who said that break the walls of the temple, break the walls of the mosque, break walls of everything in sight, but do not break the human heart, because that is where God resides. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ismael. Thank you, Kesa. Thank you, panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Akbar Ahmed. Okay, we're going to come to some questions after the panelists have spoken. So if there's any questions that any of the viewers would like to ask and are maybe a bit too shy to speak out, please feel free to put your questions in the chat, because I've got 2 questions for our beloved professor already in my mind. Okay, so the next panelist to take the stage is Baroness Sayeeda Warsi. She's a lawyer, an author, a businesswoman, and a member of the House of Lords. She was Britain's first Muslim cabinet minister, chairwoman of the Conservative Party between the times of 2010 and 2012, and a minister at the Foreign Office between 2010 and 2014. Daughter of an immigrant mill worker, Sayeeda Warsi rose to become an advisor to the leader of the Conservative Party, Michael Howard, in 2004, the youngest peer in the House of Lords, aged just only 36, in 2007, and Britain's first Muslim cabinet minister in 2010, a consistent and persistent campaigner on equalities and religious freedom. In 2007, she traveled to Sudan and famously helped to secure the release of the British teacher, Gillian Gibbons, who was on trial for blasphemy. Sayeeda Warsi is the author of The Enemy Within, a provocative and brutally honest account of the relationship between Islam and Britain, a must-read for all those interested in Islamophobia out there. Warsi has been a major driver to 3 startup businesses, 1 in the service sector, 2 in manufacturing, and all of which have developed into vibrant, successful SMEs. In government, she led the campaign to ensure that Britain became the first Western country to issue an Islamic bond, which was issued in 2014. She also chaired the Global Islamic Finance and Investment Group. Sayeeda Warsi is the chair of the Baroness Warsi Foundation and trustee of the Savara, excuse me if I pronounced it wrong, Foundation, bond of which focuses on social mobility and gender equality. Last but not least, she is an award-winning comedian to Stand Up to Cancer, whereby she won last year. And my family were all laughing. So without further ado, can I please introduce Baroness Sayeeda Warsi? Please take the stage. Oh, Sister Myriam's back. Okay.
Thank you so much. It seems like you don't need me. You do such a wonderful job.
You're the top girl. You're the top lady.
No.
Anyway, without further ado, Sayeeda Warsi, and I'll leave it to you to do your thing.
Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you very much, Ismael, for that really warm welcome, and welcome, Myriam. I think we started a little bit earlier than you'd anticipated, but it's a real pleasure to have you here, and I'm really glad you're going to be part of the conversation. It's been fantastic actually to hear the 2 speakers before me, both Lynn in relation to how hate and something that is prevalent in, unfortunately, in different forms in our society, and how it's important for us to combat all forms of hate. And also to Professor Akbar Ahmed for laying out a historic and a broader kind of international perspective to these issues. I'm going to try and focus just on the British experience, because that is really my experience, some of it personal, some of it, of course, in policy making, and much of it in campaigning. And I think there were three things that I wanted to say. Most of us, when we were growing up in the United Kingdom, if we were not white, we defined ourselves as black. And many people who felt that they were not part of the majority community, including women, people from LGBTQ communities, often identified with what I call the British Black Civil Rights Movement, because there was one, not publicized in the same way as the American Civil Rights Movement, but there definitely has and was one. All identified as people who were effectively outsiders and were fighting for equality. And in many ways, those of us who at university identified as British and Black over time were seen as British and Asian. And many of us, I think, had certainly felt during the 90s that there was a bit of a coming of age, that maybe things were heading in the right direction, that the general progress towards inclusive liberal values was something that we could all take for granted. Many of us had been success stories, social mobility success stories, and started to take our place in more mainstream societies. But I think for British Muslims, something quite unique happened during the 90s and noughties, which started to reframe our identity from a more generic Black British or Black Asian identity to one of being British and Muslim. And many of the battles that we had fought when we were younger for an equal space in society, for being made to feel like we belong and that we mattered in society, were having to be fought all over again. And as some of you will know, if you've read any aspects of my book, I checked out of Britain for about 8 to 9 months because I was unsure after September the 11th, whether I wanted to be part of a new battle for equality. And there was definitely a tension between my faith and my country. And I'm not sure that I wanted to be a part of it. Anyway, having spent 9 months overseas, which in itself is probably a book in itself, I came back because I realized that I needed to play my part. And it's then where, having been involved in student politics, I became involved in more mainstream politics and party politics, and eventually stood in politics, and the rest of it is in the public domain and is history. But the thing that I was fascinated about was the overlap between the arguments that were being made about Black Britons were being made about Muslim Britons. The kind of arguments on racism are exactly the same in most cases. It's just a new time and a new set of people and a new era. And so when I wrote my book, I did talk about, there was a time when we didn't like the Catholics very much. We thought that they were loyal to a papacy overseas. We felt they could not be trusted. Were they really friendly or were they enemies? There was a time when we treated Jewish communities incredibly badly, both at a state level and more in relation to society. Of course, anti-Semitism has once again reared its ugly head in different forms, but there was a way in which these matters have been seen before. There was a way in which we didn't treat women properly. We didn't think that they had the intellectual ability to be housewives and remain civil servants. It was only until about 35 years ago that we felt they needed to leave their jobs if they were in the civil service, if they got married. And LGBT people who were from the LGBTQ community, we considered too unsafe to be part of our armed forces and of our intelligence forces. So this element of outsiders and distrust is important. Why I say this, because often I think when we talk about the British Muslim experience and Islamophobia, I think we can go down a little bit of a rabbit hole, and we must see this as part of a broader way in which our nation has over time discriminated against communities, and over time has realized it was wrong and has found its way back. And we found solutions before, we have to find solutions again. So how do you find those solutions? Well, first of all, and this brings me on to my second part, we need to have a set of policy responses to Islamophobia. And the way you do that is by making sure that the state accurately logs, monitors, and actively works against hate crime, which is the kind of the most basic level at which you protect communities. But it goes beyond that, because some people say, well, look, we need to kind of combat Islamophobic hate crime. No, we combat hate crime. And of if it's Islamophobic and racially aggravated, there are increased penalties for that. But that is not where it ends, because ultimately Islamophobia is far more pernicious than just aggressive, violent hate crime on our streets. And we have to find a way in which we encompass all of the microaggressions that British Muslim communities face on a daily basis. And that brings me to my third part, which is, to do that, we must have a definition of what it is that we're trying to combat. And it has been probably a decade of my lifetime that I have been trying to get to a position where we can find an agreed definition of Islamophobia. 2011 was when I first spoke about this very publicly. It was the first time, and indeed the last time, that a cabinet minister has ever spoken about it, when I said Islamophobia had passed the dinner table test. And what I meant by that was that it was a form of racism which was found in the most respectable of settings, you know, people's dinner tables, editorial newsrooms, in policy think tanks, in the corridors of power. And since then, we have toyed with the idea of what phrase we use: anti-Muslim hatred, anti-Muslim sentiment, Islamophobia, Islamophobic racism. But we have struggled to find a definition. We started off with a government position that we didn't really need a definition. We have now moved on that. The Conservative government have moved on that and say that we do need a definition. Just not, unfortunately, it seems, a definition which has been supported by large sections of the Muslim community. And that is the important point here, that ultimately a definition of how a community feels has to be defined by the community that feels it. You wouldn't get a bunch of anti-Semites to define anti-Semitism, so you wouldn't get a bunch of Islamophobes to define Islamophobia. You would get people who are Muslim or perceived to be Muslim defining Islamophobia. And I'm delighted that a couple of years ago, under the umbrella of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims, we finally found an agreed definition of Islamophobia, which was drafted by parliamentarians, underpinned by academics, over 80 of them, supported by over 800 Muslim community groups and organizations. We ended up having British Muslims for Secular Democracy, the Muslim Women's Network, and the Muslim Council of Britain, and everything in between and around that, coming to an agreement to say, we're never going to find a perfect definition, but this is a working definition that we can all adopt. And that definition is this: that Islamophobia is a form of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. It is not theologically based, it is not religiously based, it is not rooted in any sect or belief or practice. It is basically saying that the racialization of a community, the putting forward of tropes which are then superimposed upon that community, and discrimination, dislike, distrust of people who are perceived to be linked to that community, whether they are or they are not, because as we all know, much of Islamophobia is directed towards people who are Sikh and are not even Muslim. So Muslim or perceived to be Muslim is effectively anti-Muslim racism. And of course, we have had all the normal arguments that we've had even in relation to anti-Semitism. Oh, you can't be racist towards people who are all different colours, that apparently race is all about the colour of your skin. All of these nonsensical arguments. Well, it's not unusual to be phobic about Islam because there are certain verses in the Quran. It's none of that. And all of that is just intellectual bigotry, with all due respect. And a decade on from when I said Islamophobia had passed the dinner table test, I say that Islamophobia is Britain's bigotry blind spot. And a recent piece from the University of Birmingham, I think literally hot off the press over the last couple of days, has said that it is the posh person's acceptable form of racism. And that's why we must deal with it, because in many ways, those of us who grew up, and excuse the term, but this is what it was called, those of us who grew up with Paki bashing being a norm in our lives and physical violence and aggression as norms in our lives, would probably find that was easier to deal with, even though it was more immediate, because it was less pernicious and it was easier to see who was doing it, what was being said, and how to deal with it. Now, I think it is much more pernicious. It is far more in respectable circles, and therefore we have to develop a sophisticated response to a problem which sadly is growing, and we have no option but to deal with it, because it relates to a community that is also a young and thriving, growing community. And the future of our country's cohesion and best interests lie in finding a space in which to be British and Muslim is entirely comfortable for the individual, but is completely acceptable for those that are not part of that community. I'm sorry if I've gone on for too long, but I genuinely hope that we're going to have wonderful conversations off the back of it. Lots of battles won, lots more battles to fight.
Thank you so much, Sayeeda, for those remarks. So much to unpack there. But before we get into the meat of that, Ismael, is it Ismael or Ismail? Oh, we've got that eternal Zoom mute problem.
Ismael. Sorry,
Ismael.
Yeah, but to some of my friends and family who don't know how to say Ismail, I tell them they can call me Ishmael. So I'm flexible. Potato, potato.
Fantastic, good to hear. So I'll go with Ismail preference. Let me invite you to make your introductory remarks then, please.
Okay, myself, Ismael Lea South, I'm a youth work consultant. So the angle where I'll be speaking from today is with regards to youth work issues. So in the youth work issues and the issues that I work with are issues around the disproportionality of youth offenders from the so-called British Muslim community. We're less than 10% of the country, but Muslims, young Muslims make up around 18 to 20% of the prisons inmates in the UK. So as we know, the Lamy report, which is being quoted by many other more eloquent and knowledgeable people than myself, have stated that there are issues of Islamophobia within the criminal justice system. And we need to find ways to tackle that, whereby hopefully youth workers like myself and outreach workers like myself can work in partnership with lawyers, for example, the Association of Muslim Lawyers or other like-minded organizations where we can tackle the disproportionality of Muslims being ill-treated within the criminal justice system. Also, another big issue that we're dealing with and many other youth workers, because I'm part of a network of British Muslim youth workers who are working in London, Birmingham, Manchester, Bradford, and they're saying that one of the biggest issues is youth unemployment. Many of our young people, even the school leavers who are trying to get jobs, there are issues. Of course, there are many Muslim youths who are excelling in industry, in entrepreneurship, and in business. Yes, that is a reality, but at the same time, there are many of our Muslim youths who are getting all the masters, the PhDs, all the academic papers, and they're finding it very hard and difficult to get a job where their names are Mohammed or Abdullah. So many of them have this, when they're doing their CVs, have been advised, and I've been guilty of advising some of my clients that come to me, on your CV, put Mo. Ashamed to say, put Mo, and maybe don't put your full surname, maybe cut your surname in half to make it more acceptable, because this field where you're looking to work in, they're not really, how can I say, so-called BAME friendly. So this is a big issue. So we need our British Muslim businesses to hopefully provide a platform and support to Muslim youths in the UK who are going through issues of youth unemployment. Last but not least, there's an issue of many Muslim youths who are going through bullying, going through issues of demonization. Because recently we were invited to a school where Muslim youths were a minority, and to give a talk about diversity, unconscious bias, and things like this. And after we gave the presentation, the Muslim youths took us aside and they were telling us that they've been told that they're groomers, they've been told that they're this and they're that. So at the time, I thought it was like an isolated case, but on social media, we found that this is a generic issue. So we're hoping, and what I'm hoping for is like therapists, counselors could find ways and platforms of coming together, and helplines from the community can provide a free service to support many Muslim youths around the UK who are going through this demonization. Because when certain issues hit tabloid press, many of our Muslim youths are suffering. So without further ado, thank you very much. And I'm honored to be speaking amongst such a great panel, and thank you. Bye-bye.
Ismael, thank you so much. And thank you to all of our panelists for their contributions so far. I guess, yeah, it's been a reminder listening to you all of the really myriad ways in which Islamophobia impacts people's lives from, you know, the political sphere down to, you know, day-to-day trying to get a job, access accommodation. I work a lot on France. One of my recent articles was an article around access to pools, public pools, Muslim women in France who choose to wear a full-length swimsuit, which is made of the same material as any regular swimsuit, only just a little bit longer, are being denied entry. So you know, I wrote about these women who are sort of organizing huge sit-ins at these pools. They're called swim-ins, where they literally come to the municipal pools with other women who consider this also to be a civil rights issue, and basically force their way into the pools to be able to just get into the swimming pool in the summer. And I call this, you know, I call them the Muslim Rosa Parks. They are the women who are saying, no, why should we not be able to swim in the same pools as everyone else? Why should we be denied access to publicly funded facilities that our taxes contribute to maintaining? And so, you know, I obviously work a lot on France, where some of these issues take a more legislative form. I think in the UK, my sense is that they take a, you know, it's actually probably a real cultural difference between France and the UK. The French are very upfront about their stance on Islamophobia. I think the British are a little bit more subtle in their expressions of Islamophobia. But one of the things I really wanted to kind of talk to the panel about was this idea around this confusion around what Islamophobia means. And, you know, there may well be a genuine confusion. Maybe people who don't experience Islamophobia, who don't know anyone who's ever experienced Islamophobia, are genuinely confused about what Islamophobia means. And so maybe everyone can kind of offer up what they think is their best working definition. I know, Sayeeda, you've obviously referred to the APBG definition already. I know that some people don't agree with that one, so please, everyone contribute. But I'm actually interested beyond that in understanding, why do people think there's so much confusion around Islamophobia? Because there's also a part of me that sort of thinks, if somebody says to me, if a person of color says to me, this person was racist towards me, my first reaction is not to go, were they? Really? In what way? I'm, you know, why would I distrust your experience of that interaction? Why would I question, if I'm not experiencing it myself, how would I possibly come and put into question your experience of that reality? So why is it a definition of Islamophobia so contentious? Who'd like to pick up on that? I mean, I'm almost tempted to go straight to you, Sayeeda, just because I know that this is an area that you worked really hard on trying to push for a working definition on, because it is so important to actually getting things done. Why is it so hard?
It's often because people who know that they are involved with organizations or in spaces where there is Islamophobia do not want Islamophobia to be defined, because then there's a yardstick against which they will be measured, right? So it's the preservation of self-interest. It's not, by the way, these arguments are not unusual. So go back to the kind of 60s and 70s, and there was a huge debate. Should it be racism? Should it be racialism? Should it be racist? Should it be racialist? I mean, you know, we don't remember those arguments anymore, but there were huge arguments being made about tiny words. Anti-Semitism, well, should it be anti-Semitism? Is it a race? On Arab Semites, etc., etc. Homophobia, really? Should we be fearful of people who are homosexual? Is it a phobia? Should it be a form of Islam? You know, and so these are not new. So every time we say this community, you know, we still have misogynists who say, oh, I really don't like the word feminist. Well, I really don't care whether you like the term feminist. We're talking about an ideological view which is based in fact, which is that women have these outcomes because of their gender. So I think that the kind of, I always say, I have never known homophobes become so pro-LGBT communities if they've discovered a strand of Islamophobia, right? You know, there are men who are complete misogynists who suddenly become feminists because they want to talk about the rights of Muslim women. And in my book, I document how during the British Empire, there were times when parliamentarians, you know, white men would stand up in parliament and say, oh, no, women shouldn't have votes. Horrific. And then would be going to North African countries saying, I really think Muslim women need to be empowered, right? So hypocrisy and racism often go hand in hand, and therefore we shouldn't be shocked at all that people who are racist also are hypocritical enough to tie us up in words and language, rather than saying, well, okay, whatever you want to call it, we know what we're talking about. It's the fact that people are not being, treating Muslims of this country with equal worth and value, and giving them a space for belonging and mattering in our society. And we need to therefore do something about it, at one end, and then obviously criminal at the other end. But because, look, sometimes in politics, you got to kind of go along and say, okay, well, if that's what we need, and we need to kind of go right back to basics, explain to you what racism is, well, we will explain to you what Islamophobia is, and we'll go away and we'll find a definition. What's fascinating now, Myriam, is that ministers stand up in on the dispatch box and say, oh, but the reason we can't agree the APPG definition of Islamophobia is because not every British Muslim agrees with it. Breaking news, not every British Jew agrees with the definition of anti-Semitism. Breaking news, not every person from the LGBT community. I mean, there's a huge debate going on about trans rights, and the diversity of opinion within those communities is so wide. But I just call it intellectual BS, and we have to see it for what it is. We have to push back and say this is nonsense, and that ultimately communities who experience these things are the ones that should define it. That we are never going to get every single British Muslim to agree this, but if we can get large numbers of British Muslims and organisations to adopt it. I mean, the positive news is that every political party, including the Conservative Party in Scotland, have adopted this working definition, this non-legally binding working definition. It's important to say that. It is like the anti-Semitism IHRA definition, which is a non-legally binding working definition. The only people who haven't adopted it is my party, the Conservative Party in Westminster. And without rolling my eyes on this Zoom call, I think we can all work out why they may not have adopted the working definition on Islamophobia, considering certainly for the last 5 to 6 years, they have been knee-deep in accusations of Islamophobia, including hundreds and hundreds of cases, and an inquiry which has been a terrible whitewash. And only 2 weeks ago, we hear once again a minister was allegedly sacked from her role, and that what was quoted at her was that she was considered to be, her Muslimness was an issue. So, I go back to it. I think that in the end, we can spend the next decade arguing about what the definition should be, or we can say we now have a working definition, let's work to that, but let's now move on and start having very specific policy responses to actually dealing with the phenomena of Islamophobia rather than being tied up with the semantics of its definition.
Thanks, Sayeeda. I'll leave it open to whoever wants to jump in, but if no one immediately wants to jump in, then I would love to ask, should I say hi, Sheriff Lynn Cooper? Is that the correct title? I should have said Baroness Warsi. I very casually called you Sayeeda. Baroness Warsi, thank you.
I'm never the Baroness to you, Myriam. You know that.
So hi,
very happy to be Lynn.
Thank you so much, Lynn. So I was just wondering, in your line of work, how significant, I mean, is there a working definition? Do you refer to the APPG? Do you find day to day that there are kind of clear obstacles that you observe around the contentiousness of the terminology? And do you feel that contentiousness serves a particular political purpose, or do you feel there is genuine confusion over what Islamophobia actually is?
Well, I think in my current role, which is incredibly non-political, I step away from anything where we could engage in something which might have some sort of political contention, and that's just not where I go. As a former lawyer, I might have gone in different directions, because of course how you define something can be, say, critical, but of course it can itself be an obstacle, because you can be putting buckets around groups, and some people may be on the margins of that definition, which of course creates some further complications. That's not to say that one shouldn't be defining this to deal with this as an issue. It's an issue, though, that we've been talking about more broadly. The problems that are caused by racism, by misogyny, anti-Semitism. If you spoke to, as I did, the chief rabbi, he would of course say there isn't a Jewish community. There are large numbers of different communities, and one has to be very sensitive to that, I think. That's not a reason for not coming up with a policy to tackle with something, to step back onto the sort of legal barriers about how we create a definition we need to tackle. I think, but you didn't hear my introduction because obviously I was speaking very much from a thing of reflection. So it just seems to me that we are, to echo the second speaker, we're at a tipping point on a lot of things. We've got a huge rise of hatred that is being focused on all sorts of people, all sorts of otherness. That I think is a real problem in the justice system. I think one is seeing a rise of that, and I think that is something that, as we say, as a community, we've really got to tackle. We've got to tackle some of the causes. And I'd perhaps like to chuck back a question, if I may. How does one try and tackle it at the root, i.e., in schools with young people? Because if you look at the justice system, it's the back end of a demand-led system. The problems start much, much earlier. And of course, I think that is true of every, quotes, phobia, hatred, misogyny, racism. Often the attitudes start very early and then are entrenched for all sorts of reasons. And I just wonder if we've got some thoughts about how one might effectively try to tackle that at a much earlier stage.
Well, Ismael, maybe we can bring you in on that point, because obviously you do a lot of work with young people. And I'm just also curious what your thoughts are on that idea that it begins with young people, because I think I'm slightly suspicious of that idea. I actually think children are a relatively blank slate. They are slates upon which society and parents impose or impose their worldviews, and really they're just sponges for like the wider environment that we create. So if we create one in which the politicians in power are making derogatory remarks around Muslim women, if it's considered fair game to legislate against particular communities, then it becomes kind of second nature to believe that that community is deserving of a second-rate level of citizenship, that actually if they commit a crime, that it has different penalties than if other people commit a crime. They can have citizenship stripped, even if their citizenship in another country is very questionable. We all know what I'm referring to, but Ismael, I'll let you pick up on that.
Can I quickly clarify?
Yeah.
I'm not saying it starts with children. They don't grow up with those views. I totally agree. What I mean is they grow up in an environment quite often where they're subjected to views. They hear views. They see things on social media. They see things on whatever you say. They're the ones who become the victims, if you like.
Right,
but then they can actually go on to perpetuate. So I was just wondering if there are things, particularly here, Ismael, working with younger people, with children, that we can do to try and help turn that narrative.
From my experience, I would say where we need to penetrate would be teachers, teaching unions, parent groups, community parent groups, and also utilize, there's thousands of interfaith organizations around the UK, and utilize the interfaith groups to do more, to go into churches, going to synagogues, temples, because I was working with an interfaith organization. They wanted us to do some subcontracting work with them. And I thought, oh yeah, this is easy work, because my job was to get different youth groups from different churches and mosques to work together. And I was shocked and surprised that there were churches and mosques, or temples and mosques, or that were right across the road from each other, that had never spoken to each other before. That was like, whoa. But the kids that attend both of the faith places go to the same schools. So the kids knew each other, but the leadership and the management of the mosque and the church, or the mosque and the temple, they never communicated, they never engaged. So I think this is where we need to penetrate the management of the faith institutions through the interfaith organizations around the country, teachers groups, and there's a lot of parent teacher groups around the country as well. And I think that's where it starts, because I agree with what Sister Myriam said. A lot of young people, when you speak to them, yes, we're going to hear some inappropriate things. That's the reality, because we're all learning. And when you're young, you're learning, and sometimes in that learning process, you say something inappropriate. And sometimes when kids are saying something rude, sometimes it's not, how can I say, it's not malicious. It's just something that they're just doing just to get one up on you. which is, I'm not condoning it, but this is from my experience. So I'm just saying that I think the way forward that we need to get more training with hopefully under the leadership of Baroness Sayeeda Warsi for teachers, trade unions, parent and teacher groups, and interfaith groups to challenge issues of Islamophobia in communities.
Thank you, Ismael. Before we go to the questions, Professor Ahmed, did you want to contribute maybe a few points, if you'd like, on maybe helping us understand Islamophobia today through more of a historicized perspective? Is there anything about the way Islamophobia has evolved over time which helps us to understand the way it's manifesting today? My sense is that there's a connection between international politics, you know, as someone who's I feel that even our own identities as Muslims are pegged in some ways to a wider climate. Is Islamophobia itself linked to wider international political developments? Is there something there that can help us understand it?
Of course, there's, Myriam. It's obvious. You're living in a global society with global media instantly flashing images across the world. And these images affect local politics. They affect how parents are looking at Islam. And in turn, they affect how parents are influencing the young. We are talking about the young being influenced. What we are not estimating is how parents, in fact, shape the young and their opinions of other communities. I know, for example, if parents come from one particular country where there's tension against Muslims or prejudice against Muslims, they will inadvertently carry that through into the next generation. The bigger point I want to make, Myriam, is this. Islamophobia has many grades. It isn't a monolith. And I've been studying this for a long time. You may have a country where we are debating wearing a scarf or not wearing a scarf, which is very important as a symbol. But we are also living in a time when actual communities, entire nations are being wiped out for being Muslim. And I give the example of the Rohingya. And I was one of the first to write about the Rohingya going back 2 decades at least. We were seeing this happening. It's like Gregory Stanton's 10 stages of genocide. We are beginning to see the stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and the world was just indifferent. The world was literally indifferent. No one did anything. And when they finally landed up with all the tragedy and the violence and the trauma in Bangladesh, now they face a very, very uncertain future. So number one, we need to understand that Islamophobia is in different stages in different countries. Number two, yes, they are definitely interconnected. So images in Bangladesh or Pakistan or the Middle East will immediately impact on Muslims in the UK and may even trigger violence. You saw the recent example of Texas when this young Muslim took the rabbi hostage in the Texas synagogue. Immediately you had the interaction with the Manchester Muslims and immediately you had the global aspect of Islamophobia. Number three, and this is very important, I still think there's great deficiency in how Muslims are presenting their case. They're too often defensive. They're too often somehow explaining, well, we almost apologetically. I like our formidable Baroness Warsi precisely for this reason. She's not apologetic, but we have to put content in our presentations because one of the great charges against Islam throughout the world, by the way, this is again global, we must understand that every incident of Islamophobia is local, but is connected to a much bigger whole, and that's the planet. One charge is that Muslims are violent. So kids are brought up to believe that Muslims are basically violent, basically barbaric, basically cruel. They're cruel to their women, they're cruel to their politics, they're cruel to their minorities. And very often they give examples which are correct. These examples are happening. There are incidents of misogyny and violence against minorities in the Muslim world. Now, it doesn't mean that that is Islam, because if you are able to mount an argument from within Islam to quote Rumi or Ibn Arabi or Hafiz and just quote some of their verses, and this is mainstream Islam, I'm not talking about hippie Islam or extreme Islam or minority Islam, so that people begin to see the beauty and the sublimity within the Islamic tradition. This is very important because the young especially the young growing up in a school, they're just seeing one very negative image. And Muslims, young Muslim children who are Muslim, have to then defend that. It's very difficult to defend some of the actions of the Muslim world. Whatever arguments you may have, right and wrong, law and being correct and so on. But if you were able to quote some Rumi or some Hafiz or some Ibn Arabi, let me give you one small quotation. This is Hafiz, who is considered the Shakespeare of the Persian language. And look at the hope and optimism he brings in this one verse. He says, this is Hafiz, I am in love with every church and mosque and temple and any kind of shrine, because I know it is there that people say the different names of the one God. So my point is that I would like to see, and I know there's an effort being made by our artists and our intellectuals, I would like this to be flooded so people, the young generation growing up in an environment where we know there's Islamophobia, we're all discussing it and we are alarmed by it, are able to be checked and countered by these beautiful, inspiring messages of Islam. That, I think, is a serious strategic defect in our campaign to check and reject Islamophobia.
Thank you so much, Professor Ahmed. And I completely agree. And I think it's really a very important point also when we consider the platforms that are offered to Muslims to contribute within the media, you know, the formats in which you are invited to participate in a program are themselves constructed in a way that allows you to either be defensive or to present yourself on your own terms, rarely. And I think by and large, a lot of what passes for inter or intra-religious dialogue on the telly, in fact, is what I would call a kind of form of religious bear baiting, which I withdrew myself from many years ago now, but which I continue to see many active participants in, you know, the choice of sort of sitting on a panel and being asked to defend positions that frankly no one should have to. But that's...
And Myriam, may I jump in here and just share something with you? I was privileged to be the Muslim commissioner on a panel of very high-level scholars studying anti-Semitism. This for the Runnymede Trust in the 90s, early 90s. And we produced this historic study called A Light Sleeper. This was about anti-Semitism. The point I want to make is while I was sitting there learning about anti-Semitism, I told my colleagues that, my God, what I'm hearing is very much what my community is experiencing. All these abusive language, the prejudice, the racism, everything was familiar to me. And it is from that panel, from that committee, that the group to study prejudice against Muslims grew, which in turn gave the concept of Islamophobia. Now it's not a satisfactory concept. We debated, but it was the nearest thing, and it caught on and it suddenly became part of the discourse. And here we are discussing this. So it pointed out that there was this widespread prejudice and it had to be fought. And I'm now talking about the mid-90s. So we've started a process. We still have a long way to go. I will still go back to my point that we have a huge ocean of treasures in the Islamic world, in Islamic history, in Islamic tradition. Let us use that in order to combat this very negative image of Muslims that a lot of people may have simply because of ignorance or prejudice or straightforward racism.
Thank you. Well, that brings me nicely to one of the questions that has been set out by Ayman Sayed, who says, within a short space of time, the LGBTQ plus community have changed laws and become accepted within the nation and government. The Jewish community have also done the same. What is it that we as a community are not doing that stops us from having the same acceptance? Who'd like to pick up on that?
I think if I can pick up on that from a British perspective. So certainly, in relation to the Jewish community, I would say we've looked at the current kind of climate that you look at in terms of the rights framework for British Jewish communities has probably been about 130 years in development. So it may seem like it's a short period of time, but it's a lot longer than that. I mean, if you go back historically, if you were, we had a Jewish prime minister, Jewish-born prime minister, who actually projected as non-Jewish when he was prime minister. So to be Jewish in public life was not particularly acceptable, and you only have to go back as early as the kind of 40s, when there were huge questions raised about Jewish loyalty and conspiracy theories just before that in relation to people who were coming in from European countries in the run-up to the Second World War. And then even more recently than that, you know, different kind of versions of anti-Semitism. So it is an ongoing battle which manifests in very different ways. And I've sat down and spoken to people from, you know, within British Jewish communities who were involved in the early days of street action, literally, you know, fist to fist fighting with the black shirts, and who now are running community organizations still protecting Jewish communities. I think it's often we forget about how long these battles have taken. The LGBTQ communities, you only have to go back to, you know, we criminalized LGBTQ communities. We did terrible physical things to them because we felt we needed to cure them. We absolutely felt they could not be part of trusted mainstream, you know, institutions, because we felt that they were not a part of that. The way in which, I mean, even now we're apologizing for and decriminalizing people that we've criminalized in LGBTQ communities. So again, that battle, I would say to you, has been, you know, 100 years in the making, if at least, you know, in terms of where we are now. So it may seem like when you look across at other communities that far more success has happened there. But as far as the British Muslim community are concerned, although, you know, you can trace connections right back to, you know, the early years of Islam, you know, 1300 years ago, 1200 years ago, 1100 years ago. But in terms of any large scale Muslim communities, I would say we're looking at a history of about 50 years. And so imagine where we are now in 50 years, and imagine where British Muslim communities and Britain will be in 50 years from now. And that is the same space where LGBTQ communities and Jewish communities are right now. And I honestly, hand on heart, believe that as far as a rights framework is concerned, and the normalization of British Muslims in British society, and the spaces that British Muslim communities will be occupying and individuals from those communities will be occupying, will probably be far further in terms of success than we've seen with the British Muslim community, British Jewish communities and LGBTQ communities. So I always say, look, I'm not an eternal, you know, some people say you just an eternal optimist. Yeah, I think there is no other alternative but to be optimistic. But I genuinely see, if you look at where this story has gone and where this journey has come, and of course, when changes start to happen, the pushback is even harder. You only have to look at what happened in the US. You know, when the progress to liberal values became stronger and stronger, and the US elected Obama, and there was this moment of kind of huge, then the kind of pushback was even uglier, and we ended up, you know, electing a potato in the White House. So I think the kind of way in which the pushback comes is going to be harder and stronger. But then when that last gasp of that craziness happens, when we go back on our march towards progressive liberal values, I think you will find that the journey becomes much quicker. And so I think you should be really optimistic about this. And adding to that, just, you know, another one of the quick questions that I saw pop up, which I think links to this, is what can we do about it individually, right? Each and every one of us is an ambassador, if you are Muslim, for British Muslims. And that means that in your everyday life, in the way in which you live your life, you are in many ways, if Islam is a part of your life, you're kind of living out those experiences. And, you know, for me, in the introduction, Ismael said, you know, I got involved in a stand-up comedy program last year for cancer research. But the British Muslim comedy scene is phenomenal at the moment. And when a community becomes so confident, even in this climate of hostility, right? When a British Muslim community feels that it is so confident that it can laugh at itself, with itself, and at others, on mainstream, you know, live at the Apollo, then that to me shows an incredible optimism within the community. And of course, when a community becomes that optimistic and front-footed, you know, the small elements in our society, and I would say in Britain, it is small elements in our society who are bigots, will push back. But, you know, I always feel that the harder and the darker and the bigger the pushback is, it means you're actually making real progress. And it's the same in feminism, it's the same in LGBTQ rights, it's been the same in relation to fighting for the rights of British Jewish communities.
Thanks, Baroness. Does anyone else want to comment on that? There's quite a few questions around the idea of interfaith work. Barbara makes a very interesting point. She says, Barbara Dresner says, you're focusing on religious communities connecting, which is great, but less people than ever are actively religious. How are we to combat these things if the focus is on the sort of diminishing power of religious groups? Ismael, maybe do you want to pick up on that one?
Yes, thanks for pointing it to me. Yes, I agree that there's a high increase of non-religious people. Yes, we could utilize interfaith organizations to access faith groups and faith communities, but also I also said teachers, trade unions. Teacher unions are very strong and very powerful, and by organizing training sessions in schools, many schools now are organizing parent-teacher conferences, parent-teacher training sessions, and they're very open to all faiths, no faiths, all communities. And also, of course, as we know, utilizing social media in a positive way, finding partnerships with the heads of, dare I say it, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and finding ways of challenging these narratives online. Because we know when the thing happened when England lost in the Euro finals, and the day after, Saka, Jadon Sancho, and the third person who I can't remember off my head right now were targeted with a lot of abuse. The social media companies had to admit and said, okay, we need to make a change. So same way they need to make a change around Islamophobia. Also, I have to state as well, a lot of Islamophobia was targeted to sports fans, because there's certain sports blogs that video blogs that I follow. I'll be open, IFL, boxing, I'm a boxing fan, sorry. I'm also an Arsenal fan, I'm sorry about that too, Arsenal Fan TV. And what I noticed is after the video finished, there would be some Islamophobia content or some known people who are Islamophobics in our society. Their video would be easy to access next. So we need to find ways of speaking to the heads and the operating chairs of these social media companies, because there's different ways. I just believe that through interfaith organizations, that would be a nice, good step, because we have people who are doing it at a policy making level, legislation level, who are doing a great work with Sister Baroness Sayeeda Warsi, working in partnership with various organizations. But we need to not just channel it in one road, but in various different roads to hopefully bring Islamophobia down.
Thank you, Ismael. We've got one comment here, which I'd like to connect to another question that I'm hoping Professor Ahmed and Lynn Cooper might be able to pick up on together, or one after the other. We've got an anonymous attendee saying, the horrible things people call each other make me very sad, but don't heal differences. I'm not a Muslim, but the word kafir also sounds awful, no matter what its roots are. Can that also be a word that is not used to describe non-believers? It isn't a healing word for non-Muslim allies. There's a lot to unpick there. I thought maybe Professor Ahmed could pick up on that bit. And then obviously we've also got a question here from Dr. Karamat Iqbal, who says, how can the non-Muslims support this struggle? And I sort of think the two are actually quite connected, which is, the language we use to refer to one another in these conversations obviously have an impact on how we feel, how people feel included, excluded. I mean, the irony is that my understanding of the word kafara, the root of the word kafara, is the people who cover up, it's the people who cover up the truth. So that could never refer to somebody who just doesn't know about the faith, or it's somebody who's sort of like very deliberately, maliciously trying to conceal truth. And so I personally would not use the word kafir at all very lightly, just to refer to people who weren't of the same faith as me. But I'll stop talking now. I'll hand over to the two panelists to pick up on that.
Well, Myriam, I'd like to refer to Brother Ismail's comment about his being a sports fan before I get to your question about kafir. I want to refer to the great, or perhaps the greatest of all time, Muhammad Ali. His being an ambassador of Islam, almost without wanting to become an ambassador, he was loved and revered literally all over the world. And he went through some really very, very tough times. As a boxer, his titles are stripped, he faces investigations, prejudice, yet he did not waver from his faith. And I think what emerges is this heroic character, almost like a Marvel series superhero. And what I enjoyed was that when he came to Britain, and you remember there was a match with the British champion, this is in the 60s, the British champion hit him so hard that it almost broke his jaw, and Muhammad Ali fell down. And he then later, in an interview, said he hit me so hard that my ancestors in Africa felt the shock of that blow. So it was his gentility, his love, his reaching out, and his high intelligence that won people. I think that's a very important example for any Muslim who's trying to reach out and create bridges, because you never heard him abuse any community or downgrade any community. He really reached out, and I had the privilege of actually meeting him once, which was a great moment for me because I remained such a fan. Now, coming to your point about kafir. Now, kafir, of course, is a very sensitive issue. It's been misunderstood. It's been misunderstood by non-Muslims and by Muslims. So over history, you've had a lot of over-enthusiastic Muslims at the time when Islam was dominant 1,000 years ago, very often charging in, especially in South Asia, where many non-Muslims accuse Muslims of breaking temples and imposing all sorts of taxes because people were kafir, etc. But again, as a scholar, I look back to Islam. I look back to what Islam says about human beings. First of all, Myriam, as you know, the Quran talks about the universes, that God is the God of all the universes. Now, this is something that's coming down in the 7th century. And you ask yourself, God is defining himself or herself or whatever gender you want to give God, not in terms of being the God of the Muslims, but of God of all creation, including plants and animals and so on. It's the sophistication is breathtaking. Remember the context when it's coming out. Secondly, God defined himself out of the 99 names, the two most beautiful names of Rahman and Rahim. Now, I ask myself, when God is saying, I am Rahman and Rahim, I am beneficent and compassionate, how can Muslims then say, you're kafir, we despise you, we look down upon you? Every individual, and the Quran again says this, has a right to choose his own faith. There is no compulsion in Islam and in religion. This is what the Quran says. So the notion of kafir has been grossly misunderstood, misrepresented, and then the associated concept of jizya, or taxing people who are not Muslim, is equally misunderstood, because I've studied Muslims in Andalusia, Muslims in India, and it's something, again, I think Muslim scholars, Muslim historians have to look into and then give us an interpretation, because I think it has been grossly distorted and misinterpreted.
You kindly invited me to say something, but I'm going to say it on a completely different thing, because I don't think have the authority to speak on anything that as Professor Ahmed talked about the background in theological terms. But what I think, I'm sort of speaking perhaps to where I started from when I gave a few words, that I think we as non-Muslims all have to challenge ourselves as to how we think about others, the expressions we use. This is something obviously that applies if one is talking about a whole range of people. And we have to, I think we've all got to take stock about the language we use. I think that is incredibly important. And the otherness seems to be a default option of mankind. The fact that we perhaps revert into groups, we criticize others almost as a reaction to stresses and to economic stresses, which is where I think partly we may be seeing some of the problems Professor Ahmed referred to, the sort of growth of really worrying signs around the world, tempered by extremely positive signs on other things. And so I think education and compassion and understanding, and speaking to the young early about the importance of this, because as somebody said earlier, prejudices can start in the families, it can be carried forth, is so important. And that is a long burn and a slow burn, but a really vital burn, it seems to me. And speaking to Baroness Warsi's point, we have made huge strides. And when I was at school, when homosexuality was a criminal offence, I've seen enormous changes in the attitudes and rights towards women, but it always takes time. And I think it's all of our collective duties, regardless of our faiths, to work constructively to surmount these barriers. And the barriers are often rooted in prejudice, as well as historical experience, of course.
Thank you so much. We have a question here. We have a few comments actually, which I can read out. Separate points raised by Professor Ahmed and Baroness Warsi when joined together are impactful. Avoiding the trap of language being used and focusing on the real beauty of Islam. Islam meaning submitting to God as a starting point. For example, Islamophobia could be interpreted as being anti-Islam or anti-God. I wanted to come back on this idea that Muslims have to show the beauty of Islam. I know, Sayeeda, you were referring to the example of the idea that, you know, we've got a few, for example, comedians who are doing really well out there, sort of being out, very proud of their identity, but also successful in their comedic careers. I do wonder whether that is not something slightly of a trap that Muslims could end up having to exist as model citizens. You know, the idea that Muslims have to, I mean, obviously as Muslims, we're all striving as per our faith to be the best version of ourselves. But, you know, some of us are not going to be, some of us are going to be expletive inserts. And, you know, we're no less citizens, or we're no less British, and we're no less worthy of, you know, consideration, I suppose, than anybody else on the basis of that. And so I'm just wondering whether the idea that we have to promote a sort of kinder face of Islam isn't in itself sort of playing a sort of slightly dangerous game. So what those that don't conform to the happy, cuddly version of Islam are open to some of the more problematic aspects of Islamophobia?
Yeah. I know that we have to finish at 4:30, so I'm going to try and answer this really quickly. Two parts to this. You make a really powerful point. And the answer to that is, one, we are all equal before the law. And what is fundamentally British is the rule of law, and that we are equal before the law. And that's why campaigns fighting against Clause 9, for example, of the Nationality and Borders Bill is absolutely that, which is you can't have different classes of citizenship based upon the heritage of where somebody came from 4 generations ago. So I think in terms of how we are treated as British Muslims before the law, and why racial equality legislation must apply, and why we must have definitions which outlaw the discrimination towards Muslim communities based upon their identity or perceived identity. Absolutely, I think that's one space, and the law must apply equally. And that means we will also get people who break the law, who will go to prison, etc., etc. And I'm sure Ismael could give us a huge discussion about how actually lots of British Muslims or Black British Muslims or minority communities are treated differently within the criminal justice system. And he referred to David Lammy's report right at the beginning. So I think there is a battle there about equality before the law and constantly fighting for racial equality and justice within the parameters of the law. The part that I refer to is really societal change. And even the APPG definition is actually a non-legally binding working definition. And the reason it is that is because how you are treated in a workplace is one thing, but actually it's the daily microaggressions that go on in people's lives, which you can't go to court for and sue your employer for, and go before a civil court for, or plead before, or look at how criminal justice systems are working. And for societal change, society has to be, masses, the majority, have to see faces of Islam that they are familiar with. And at the moment, what they're seeing is faces of Islam that paint a single picture in the media of these are aggressive, barbaric, terrorist people, or they are involved in sexual offences. And that's the face that they're seeing through. So the law, I think, is a separate approach. Society, I think, is important. And some of that involves, I mean, the reason I agreed to do the stand-up thing, Myriam, which is certainly in public life, certainly, you know, in politics, it was a pretty scary thing to do, to put yourself out there and to try and kind of learn this art of stand-up in such a public way and then be kind of voted on at the end of it. And one of the reasons why I did it is because I spent so much time saying we need to have better Muslim representation. Why aren't they in the mainstream? Why can't I turn on television and see them on daytime TV? Why can't I see Muslims here? And then every time I've been asked to do anything like that, I've said no. And then I think because I was 50 and it was in the middle of COVID, and I thought, you know what, why not? And I spent all this time talking. And so that's the bit that I say to you, it is important because we know that there are lovely, cuddly, kind, you know, amazing, warm, happy Muslims in our communities. Unfortunately, that's never a face that's displayed to mainstream Britain because there are vested interests in displaying us in a certain way. So I don't think we have to, we have to be a community without, without mistake and criminality and bad and all of that. Of course, we're going to have that, but we also need to make sure. I went before the Home Affairs Select Committee on a inquiry into Islamophobia within the media. And the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee said to me, Baroness Warsi, if you could see more positive pictures about Muslim communities and positive stories about Muslim communities, do you think that would then kind of balance out all the negative stories about British Muslims? And I just said, you know what, I just settle for accurate stories about British Muslims, you know? And I think because we haven't even got to the point of accurate reporting of this community of 4 million plus, we therefore have to counter the negative reporting by having this alternative, constant other face of British Muslims that we're also familiar with.
Thank you so much, Baroness Warsi. Obviously, just before you, I'm going to ask everyone to do their concluding remarks now, but Ahmed Ali said, Baroness Warsi, before you finish, can you do a joke? Not to put you on the spot at all, though. Oh, yes, I can see you're thrilled at the prospect of having to come up with one. Maybe we'll leave it for the last point, even though you're on mute right now. We'll let everyone do the round so you can have a second to think about it. I'd love for everyone to just give me their final remarks. When doing the final remarks, I'd love for, there was a point Baroness Warsi raised around vested interests, and we haven't really touched on those. And although we're coming to the conclusion here, would be really interested to hear in those conclusions, maybe a point or two about those vested interests. Why is it big business? There's a book in America published called The Islamophobia Industry. There's definitely a sense that there are people who profit from the negative representation of Muslims. I myself can see that, TV certainly is much more, fiery if you can get someone saying completely something very outrageous. And, we've got no shortage of those people in any community. So concluding remarks with maybe a few thoughts on the vested interests who benefit from the Islamophobia industry. Who wants to start? Professor Ahmed, since you're unmuted, maybe?
Yes, I want to, since these are the concluding remarks, I just want to thank you and panel and the host for organizing this. I think it's really not only an important exercise, but an urgent exercise. And I just request you to continue doing this, and your voice should really be mainstream. And you talk about vested interests in media. The study you're referring to was called Fear Inc. Now, Fear Inc. was written about 10 years ago. It was a compilation of half a dozen scholars, and they studied the Islamophobic content coming out of about 70 or 80 centers in the United States. Now, these centers were linked one to the other. They were very well funded, and they were thriving because they were promoting and producing Islamophobic content. So if someone wanted to come on television and say how bad the Muslims are, here was the content. They were encouraging books being published, lots of books, and selling well, some becoming bestsellers, with titles. And I must say one thing, a lot of Muslims were falling for this, and they were writing these books, The Trouble with Islam and How Terrible Islam Is, and Let Me Reform Islam. Books like that were being produced and selling. So there was certainly an aspect of vested interest and an aspect of a commercialization of this subject. Unfortunately, the impact then on the ordinary Muslim was negative and painful and harmful, and that is what we are challenging by making people aware of it. It's not an easy task, even in the United States or the UK. It's not easy to get into the media unless a Muslim is involved in something very negative. A filmmaker, a documentary maker will find that if he were to, or she were to make a documentary, go to a country like Pakistan and say, I'm making a documentary on people throwing acid on women's faces or killing women or honor killings, they'd find a lot of support automatically. There'd be budgets, there'd be production teams ready to film. But if it's any other aspect of ordinary Muslims living ordinary lives, they'll find very little takers. So these are all aspects that we need to be, I don't know what we can do to fix them, but we need to be aware of them. Thank you. Thank you very much, Myriam. Thank you also.
Ahmed. Ismael, concluding remarks and vested interests.
Yes, that's a very good question. As we know, Muslims are consistently demonized and dehumanized in mainstream media and within policies, generic policies in society. And I am always inspired by this community worker. Her name was Victoria Michaeladis, and she used to contact me to connect her to various women groups because she realized that many women in communities, Muslim women especially, were being attacked and being abused, but were not reporting it because they had the mentality, nothing's not gonna get done. And basically, I thought to myself, I don't know if I have the time, but through her passion and her persistence in calling me morning, noon, and night, and whatever. Anyway, so because of her persistence, she inspired me. So I connected her to a few organizations, thinking I'm gonna get my ear chewed off after she gives a talk. But now I've seen the fruits of her work. Now many women and girls that I know who wouldn't report something to the police are now, anytime they get any form of abuse, any form of anything, they're reporting it to the police. So in the spirit of Victoria Michaeladis, I urge for anyone going through any form of discrimination, do not suffer in silence. And we should teach our young people as well, if they're going through any form of discrimination, not to suffer in silence and to speak out against it, to report it. And that's the way of challenging it. As we know, as you said, the vested interest, as we know, there's various organizations, think tanks, organizations out there who are investing heavily into Islamophobic content. There's people that I've known, and they're doing this in the mainstream community, but now they're contacting some of my friends and colleagues from the Black community who aren't Muslim, who are either from the Rastafarian faith or the Christian faith or no faith, and they've told me that they've been contacted by this organization to interview someone or certain people who are known to be Islamophobic and to promote Islamophobic rhetoric. So just to say that they're not only pushing this in the mainstream society, they're pushing it in the Black community too. And I urge for Muslim communities to be aware, and anyone who's in any position who are challenging Islamophobia, do not give up the fight. Keep on doing what you're doing, and God bless you in your work.
Well, thank you. Hi, Sheriff Lynn Cooper, if I could ask you your concluding remarks.
Well, I don't think I'm going to comment on vested interests because I think that might get me into the wrong territory, except for the fact that unfortunately that seems to be sort of so current in every facet of life and always probably has been. So I think I'm going to go back to basis A, to say, to echo everybody, it's been a fantastic privilege for me to have the opportunity to be a guest on this panel, and I thank you for that, and to have the opportunity to, I suppose, express what is a very general view, but I think is an important view because I encounter it a lot during this office. I think we have to work very hard, regardless of what our faith, no faith background is, race, gender, etc., to understand and be tolerant of each other. And that has to for young people through whatever means to break down barriers and prejudice and ignorance, which I think was a word that was expressed, because it's very easy, I think, to prey upon minds otherwise. Of course, social media, which I think is a big issue and certainly something that crops up in the criminal justice debate a lot, the influence of that on forming people's behaviours and attitudes, that's something I think we as a society need to take very, very hard look at. But I think
we may have lost you there, Lynn. Lynn, are you still with us?
Engaging in these topics and thinking actively to counter it, I think, is the positive, and we need to all work hard to take that narrative forward and to make sure that we counter such prejudices which can lead to so much harm.
Thank you so much. Well, look, it leaves me just to thank all of our panel, Ismael Lea South, Lynn Cooper, Akbar Ahmed, Sayeeda Warsi, all titles included, of course. Thank you for being here with us. Thank you for your contributions and thoughts on this important topic. Just to signal for those who are interested, the next panel that you might be interested in connected to this topic is Young British and Muslim, which is on Wednesday the 19th between 6 and 7:30 p.m. So thank you once all again, and thank you to everyone who's joined us for this webinar. We look forward to welcoming you to the next one. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sayeeda, do you want to give your joke?
Oh, I thought I'd escaped that one. You know, I haven't got a joke, but I've got a really funny story. This is a true funny story from last weekend. My nephews came to stay with me, two of them, one's 10 and one's 13. And amongst the tasks I had to do with them was obviously to allow them to play on their devices for a little while and then do their homework. And so as the day went on, I said, I really think you need to do your homework because you've been on your devices too long. And they said, we really, and the elder one, the 13-year-old said, I really haven't been on my device that long. And I said, no, I think I've been watching. I think I have seen the evidence with my own eyes. You really have been on your device too long. And he said, I really think we should wait for the outcome of the Sue Gray inquiry. Touche.
You can have that one, Baroness Warsi.
My nephew put me back in my box.
Yeah, great stuff. Well, thank you once again to everyone, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you to Macfest.